God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob.
The title of today's Torah Watchman Show edition is Indentured Servitude versus Slavery. This is actually a very controversial subject, okay? Ya'ar ben-Emmett likes to be in the middle of controversy when it leads to a central truth, and that's why I am spending this time doing the investigative analysis and research on this documentary, okay? We all know that race relations probably in America is probably as low as it's been for some time. The Black Lives Matter movement, the killing of George Floyd, all the burning down and looting of our communities, police stations, things of this nature, just complete outrage and anarchy sweeping through America. Toward the end of President Trump's administration, okay? It's still ongoing right now. But I, as an Orthodox Jew, I would like to speak out forcibly on the issue of first of all, the abomination of using people as chattel, as portable property, slavery against people's will, to determine their own destiny, their own way of life, okay? This slavery did not begin in the United States, okay? It may have ended in the time of President Abraham Lincoln, at the end of the Civil War, the war between the North and the Confederacy. It may have also fueled also flames in the 1960s during the time of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., when 1,000 men marched on Washington, D.C. and demanded civil rights for all people, which is passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But let me give you some history here to understand the proper context, okay? Now, international slave trade, what is that? I am actually reading information from Britannica online. If you remember back in the 70s and 80s, sometimes at least in the United States, you would have an encyclopedia salesman come by your home trying to sell you a huge, large case of Britannica encyclopedias. But now this is online. It's actually a published source, and there's a wealth of information. So that's where I'm getting my information from about the international slave trade. So again, international slave trade did not begin in the United States, okay? Even though a lot of activists, a lot of progressive liberal-minded people in America still blame the United States, even our founding fathers, for the brutality and abomination of slavery, okay? So let's find out where it began, okay? Believe it or not, the New Stone Age, okay, the Nephek period, you can think about the time when Joshua came into Canaan, the promised land. During that time, we're talking about 3,500 years roughly, okay? And it may be assumed that slaves were not far behind the high value items such as amber and salt in becoming commodities. Okay, unfortunately, slaves, or the act of slavery, the essence of that, has been around for thousands of years, like I said, since the time of Joshua, since the time of the New Stone Age period, as a direct result of people's behavior, the occupation and invasion of foreign territory, the defeat of a warring nation, defeat of a tribe of people. Make choices. Do you want to take back their women and children? Do you want to destroy the entire village, kill every person there, or bring back its people as a workforce, as property? This has happened for thousands of years, and people back then looked at it as a norm. It's just a direct result of conflict between human beings. Now, even among relatively simple people, one can trace the international slave trade. It does not take a lot of research and knowledge here. Thus, as this trade was going on among peoples of Siberia, and Russia before the arrival of the Russians in the 16th, 17th centuries. Okay, this has been going on forever. The slaves so traded were neighboring people captured in warfare. Okay. And also similar, the need for commerce, the need for a workforce. If the people of the citizens of a nation did not have enough men, for instance, to do agrarian type work and things like that, they may be tempted to go and barter and buy slaves, or go and invade a surrounding territory and take the people back by force. Okay. The international slave trades that provided huge amounts of property, wealth, and fortune for occupying people over a period of time, been known as great population reservoirs. Okay, two such reservoirs were the Slavs. You hear about the Slavs in Ukraine, in that area in Russia, and contiguous agriculturalist Iranians from the antiquity of the 19th century, okay? And sub-Saharan Africans entered the scene here from around the beginning of the Common Era to the middle of the 20th century, okay? A third such reservoir of people, of chattel per se, probably was the Germanic, Celtic, and Romance peoples who lived north of the Roman Republic and Empire, and who half a millennium later became the victims of the Viking slave trades. Like, the Vikings were responsible of slave raids and stealing people from towns and communities along the shore, the coastal areas of different lands that they invaded. Okay, the dynamics of these raids were as follows: a large demand for slave labor prompted neighboring people, typically migratory or nomadic in habit, to prey on sedentary agriculturists living in the reservoir of total array of people that were available for property, chattel. The raiders developed techniques of which the sudden surprise, shock and awe was perhaps a major one, that put the settled peoples at a disadvantage. Okay, for they never knew when and where the raiders might strike. It was random. So populations in the reservoir could be completely depleted, as happened in the East Slavs living in the steppe south of Oka and between Volga and Dnieper rivers from the year 1240 to the 1590s, or they could migrate half a continent away to escape the slave raiders. This caused mass migration of peoples, finding new places to live unmolested, as did the Ndembu in Africa. The Ruthenians, frontier Poles, Cossacans, and numerous African peoples were sorely depleted by these slave raids. One alternative was to fight back, and as did the Muscovite Russians and the Baya of the Damua, now northern Cameroon and West Africa. And the consequence in both instances was the creation of an authoritarian garrison state. So You hear about the formation of Russian Empire, later the Soviet Union. Well, they were victims of these slave raids, and it actually created a more authoritarian or dictatorial type society, just for preserving life, and of their culture and their people. The international slave trades developed into elaborate networks. For example, in the 9th and 10th centuries, Vikings and Russian merchants took East Slavic slaves into the Baltic. Okay, we're talking about Ukraine. They were then gathered in Denmark for further transshipment and sold to Jewish and Arabic slave traders. Yeah, there were rich secular Jews in the middle of the mercantile exchange business. Unfortunately, during that time as well. Okay, they had blended in with other people. They were not observant Jews. They were like everyone else as businessmen. This is just the evil of those days, okay? Who took them to Verdun and Lyon. There, some of the males were even castrated, okay? From those places, the slaves were sold to harems throughout Moorish Spain, Islamic Spain, and Iberian Peninsula, and North Africa. In the 9th century, the Baghdad Caliphate got slaves from Western Europe via Massalia, Venice, and Prague. Slavic and Turkish slaves from Eastern Europe and Central Asia via Derbent, Itil, Kazim, and Samarkand. I know these names don't mean anything to you today, but historically they refer to different territories that were endemic at that time. And African slaves via Mombasa, Zanzibar, the Sudan, and the Sahara. The Mongols in the 13th century brought their slaves first to Kararum, whence they were sold throughout Asia, and then later to Sarai on the lower Volga, whence they were retailed throughout much of Eurasia. Following the breakup of the Golden Horde, the Crimean Tatars took their chattel, again, human trade, portable property, which were human beings treated as slaves, and a cafe in Crimea. Okay, I'm using names now that are familiar today. Whence it was transported across the Black Sea and sold throughout the Ottoman Empire and elsewhere. Arabs developed similar supply networks, supply chains out of Black Africa across Sahara, across the Red Sea, from Ethiopia and Somalia, and out of East Africa, which supplied the Islamic world and Indian Ocean region with human chattel. I may have mentioned this before, but I've recently confirmed on my mother's side, going back, I'm not sure how many generations, I would approximate about 6 or 7 great-grandmother from Kenyan bloodlines, okay? Whoever that is, and I'm sure I'm trying to identify this person. I don't know that she was a byproduct of the slave trade. It's quite possible. Who knows? Or it could be part of this mass migration thing. People running away from these slave traders and these raiding parties. Okay, more close to the time frame that I'm working here. Beginning about 1500, a similar process occurred along the coast of West Africa to supply the transatlantic slave trade. The Africans were captured by other Africans in raids and then transported to the coast. One may assume the number of casualties of African slave raiding was nearly as high as the Crimean Tatar slave raiding. The captives, primarily adult males, were assembled on the coast of African rulers and kept in holding pens. Have you seen the movie Roots in America? It got a lot of awards, but it's not very historically accurate. Why am I saying that? Because there's false portrayals and stereotype of white Europeans going into Africa, savagely going into African villages and communities and taking away all as many Africans as they could grab that didn't run away or they didn't have to kill, whatever, in chains. Well, that was not true. African tribes in different parts of Africa, in the Saharan Africa, were at war with one another, for competing for territory and resources. There was famine in the area. that drove people to look for other resources. They warred against each other, and they took their fellow citizens, fellow people, as slaves themselves. And they used these slaves of other tribes that were defeated as bartering items for anyone else, a greater power than themselves coming in, wanting to will and deal on different things. I'll give you this for this human person to be used as a slave, okay? I'm not justifying any of this. It was barbaric and evil, but this is actually what was happening, and it led to the great migration of African slaves to the Americas, okay? Again, they're predominantly adult males. African rulers who did not allow the Europeans to move inland often conducted their wholesale business on the coast. This is a profitable business for African business people and even royalty there, to just empty land that they had conquered of the previous people, tribal people. There were issues of disease and famine, like I said, that drove people to make different business decisions as well, just to survive. The African rulers did everything they could to encourage European sea captains to come to their port, because again, they wanted the business. So you hear of many people in America, I just have to bring this up, the so-called white guilt, that all the white, if you're not colored, if you're a white person like me, red beard or whatever, and if you're a Jew, you consider it as a white supremacist, you should have a certain amount of white guilt. In other words, you should give money and donations, checks, funds to families, descendants of slaves, to be able to recompense what they went through. Well, if to be honestly and historically correct here, that if African Americans want to blame anyone, anyone, it's the original African rulers that took these people to the port and facilitated moving them transcontinentally, migration to other parts of the world in support of the international slave trade, okay? This was also known as the Middle Passage. Brazil benefited from the slave trade. On the slave ship cruise that embarked Liverpool in 1787, unfortunately, about less than half people even survived. These were horrific trips across the ocean. Lack of food, fresh water, and things of this nature. Many people died on their trip going from Europe to the Americas and to South America. The interest as far as profitability of businesses, facilitating the international slave trade, had its peaks, had its valleys, had its interests. There was also a series of competing ideas in the Middle Ages about the morality of slave trade in general. By the end of the Middle Ages, for instance, slavery no longer existed in England. A famous Cartwright decision of the reign of Elizabeth I, 1569, held that England was too pure and the era for slaves to breathe in. Okay, so it was considered by some people, some rulers, by the 16th century as a immorality that could not be tolerated. Okay. However, slavery persisted longer in Eastern Europe. In Poland, it was replaced by the second enslavement. This is the point I'm trying to make get to, that slaves eventually became known as serfs. The sale and purchase of slaves were forbidden in the 15th century, so they had to find other ways to use an agrarian workforce to other businesses and powers that be to be able to benefit, for profit. A similar process occurred in Lithuania, where slavery was formally abolished in 1588. In Russia, it came to an end with the first enslavement again. Slaves, property, chattel eventually became serfs. Agricultural slaves were formally converted into serfs in 1679. Household slaves were converted into house serfs by 1723. Whatever you call it, how you ever define it, these people had left their homeland and lived in foreign nations as a agrarian workforce, essentially. Okay, identify with the plight of Jews in the diaspora too. Okay, so in the Caucasus and Central Asia, slavery persisted within the second half of the 19th century. Russian Empire grew, and its hegemony spread. It adopted the tendency of the 19th century imperialist powers to enforce abolition when embarking upon colonization. Okay, thus the conquest of the Caucasus led to the abolition of slavery by the 1860s, and the conquest of Central Asia of the Islamic Khajates of Bukhara and Samarkand and Kahiva by the 1870s. So I'm giving you some history here, okay? Chief Justice Mansfield ruled in 1772 that James Summerett, a fugitive slave from Virginia, could not be forcibly returned to the colonies by his master. So talking about colonial United States during this time, leading up to the independence movement of the 13 colonies, fate of slavery, and most of the rest of the world depended on the British abolition movement, which was initiated by the English Quakers in 1783. When they presented the first imported anti-slavery petition in Parliament, they were following the Pennsylvania Quakers, who had voiced opposition to slavery in 1688. I guess they found something in their Bible that said this was in a more outrage. The Vermont Constitution in 1777 was the first document in the United States to abolish slavery. Another sign of the spread of anti-slavery feeling was the Declaration of the U.S. Constitution, okay? Believe it or not, the U.S. Constitution, Founding Fathers, despite what you hear in the propaganda in the United States today, okay, that in the U.S. Constitution, they were abolitionists to slavery. When the framers of the Constitution, that was in their mind, okay? That was in their mind. The world was changing at that time, philosophically, about the treatment of human beings, or the ill treatment of human beings. In the U.S. Constitution, the importation of slaves could be forbidden after, it took about 20 years, by 1808, the Act of March the 2nd, 1807, actually forbade trading in slaves in Africa. But what do you do with the slaves you have in the country? Well, before the rise of cotton, some people hope that the natural process is combined with the prohibition of infusion would put an end to slavery. After the invention of the cotton gin, put an end to a lot of the slavery or the need, and just did not make it profitable anymore, okay? In 1807, the British abolished the slave trade altogether in all the colonies. It was not no longer politically correct. In the Caribbean, slavery was abolished by the British parliamentary fiat, effectively July 31st, 1834, when 776,000 slaves in the British plantation colonies were freed. You can imagine the feeling of that freedom there when they were released. The British imperial emancipation can be attributed to the growing power of philanthropic movement and a double switch in the focus of the British Empire. Yes, the change of monarchy, rulership, Catholic monarchy, of course, Anglican Church, and things of this nature. Geographically, from west, the Caribbean, to the east, India, and economically, from protectionism to the laissez-faire. Okay, so there were political, geopolitical changes and transition in the early 1800s. The British move in 1807 to abolish the slave trade had immediate impact on the juntas struggling for independence in Spanish America. So one thing led to another, okay? The slave trade was declared illegal in Venezuela and Mexico by 1810, in Chile in 1811, and Argentina in 1812. 1817, Spain signed a treaty with Britain agreeing to end the slave trade in their country, okay? But the trade continued in remaining Spanish colonies until 1880, okay? Chile freed its black slaves in 1823, Mexico abolished slavery completely in 1829, and Peru in 1854. The American anti-slavery movement, linked to the Second Great Awakenings, succeeded in arousing the immense hostility between non-slave North, where most of the states had voluntarily abolished slavery, by 1804, with the slaveholding South, where the peculiar institution became even further entrenched because of the spread of cotton cultivation. I said a cotton gin pretty much put an end to need of an agrarian workforce, chattel or whatever, to be forced to harvest cotton. By the 1850s, however, the old abolition movement had flagged. Again, change in political influences, religious influences, new people coming into power. It took political developments and forces, especially emerged the free soil movement, conflict of the expansion of slavery. Of course, Abraham Lincoln Emancipation Proclamation, very famous historical landmark agreement, January 1st, 1863, after the Civil War ended, put an end to slavery on the road to extinction in the United States. It took time. It took time because it did not end completely. Individual families, people with plantations across all the states of the United States, they did things in secret and they got away with a lot of filthy things. The proclamation confirmed in the Constitution, known as the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, which put an end to slavery. Puerto Rico abolished slavery in 1873 and Cuba 1880. Brazil followed behind. Took longer because of the profitability of their coffee. However, by May 13, 1888, all Brazilian slaves were ben-Emmetted, repatriated. Initially, there was some opposition by the coffee growers, but the resistance crumbled immediately. Okay, the European colonization movement of the second half of the 19th century put an end to slavery in all parts of Africa. Having seen in the abolition of slavery in most of Latin America and South Asia, the British turned their attention to Africa. Again, they had colonies throughout the world. Israel was actually under the Commonwealth of Great Britain during that time. They had Hong Kong was a colony, Australia was a colony, so they had influence all over the world. Okay. Zipping through this, the imperial government formally abolished slavery in China in 1906. We haven't talked about the Asians here. Some parts of Africa and much of the Islamic world retained slavery at the end of the World War I. For this reason, the League of Nations, a letter became the United Nations, took the final extinction of slavery to be one of their main obligations. Okay, so you want to know what was in our mission charter? Transitioning between League of Nations and United Nations, the abolition of slavery. By World War II, slavery was abolished in Liberia and Ethiopia. The United Nations, they had a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the European Convention of Human Rights proclaimed that the morality and illegality of slavery. Slavery was abolished in most Islamic countries, over its persisted in Saudi Arabia in the 1960s. It finally was made illegal in the Arabian Peninsula by 1962. So 1962 was probably, I hate to admit my age, but right before I was born. So slavery was internationally was still legal in some places in the world. What I just described to you is over a period of hundreds of years and thousands of years about the interest in using human beings as chattel, as property against their will. Okay, this evil of slavery has been endemic in humanity in general. Not just white people. I told you that even Jews participated in the mercantile exchange part of this. Facilitators, we all are guilty of using human beings who are created all in the equal image of God as something less than human. African in the United States used to be referred to someone as like 1/3 of a person. Actually, Jews have been referred to that too. Jews have been, you hear about Egyptian slavery for hundreds of years and things of that nature. Throughout the diaspora, Jews were continually removed forcibly from their communities. In slavery, the fall of Jerusalem in 1935 CE resulted in Jews taken off by the Roman Empire into Africa and sold off as slaves. The evil goes, it includes all of humanity, okay? All of humanity, including Africans. I told you before, they went to war against their fellow brothers and sisters in other nations, other tribes there, defeated them, and they took back the booty. They took back the chattel as part of the human slave trade, and then sold off at the highest bid in the slave market for the international slave trade, okay? So guilt goes either direction, okay? It's not just white guilt, it's not black guilt, it's not Jewish guilt, it's not Russian guilt, German guilt, British guilt. It's just everyone shares in this abomination known as slavery, okay? We're more civilized today than to do this anymore. However, in some parts of Africa, still by certain Islamic nations, they are still doing this. You hear about human trafficking. I was in Guantanamo Bay for a year and a half. The main mission of the Navy there was to mitigate against human trafficking. What's going on in our country since January 12th, 15th of 2021, essentially as human trafficking across the border by gangs, Mexican gang cartels, bringing people over by the highest bid. But, philosophically and religiously, Christians allowed this to occur for a long period of time before it was considered evil. Okay, I already described certain, Queen Elizabeth I in England, other monarchies, Roman Catholic monarchies in Spain and elsewhere, permitted this because they needed it for the expansion of their empires, mercantile exchange, using ships, going to India, looking for spices and things like that, looking for gold and all of this. There's many justifications of this. Quakers, however, who were part of the Anglican Church, who came for religious freedom reasons and just starting a new life, new hope in colonial America, were against slavery from the beginning. Since they controlled many of the church Christian doctrine in the North, I say above the Mason-Dixie line. I know if you're other parts of the world, you may not understand these terms, but the Civil War, the Confederacy, going to war and declaring independence from the North. The North was dominated by Republican conservative people, and yes, the Quakers, the Anglicans, other people, the Pilgrims were a lot of very religious, and they did not support slavery. Okay, the South allowed it to happen, and politically, they were controlled by predominantly Democratic politicians, aristocrats. Okay, so the North was dominated by Republican people as far as politically worldview on slavery is evil, even though it occurred in some small places. It was mostly dominated in the South simply because of the need of the agrarian culture there, the business market and things of that nature, like the cotton, tobacco, and coffee. Would you believe that Christian pastors, Baptist ministers, as predominantly in the southern United States, justified continuing the slave trade, slave ownership, even the barbaric mistreatment of human beings as slaves that were under their not so loving care, justified their misinterpretation from their Old Testament. They said essentially the Jews in ancient Israel practiced slavery too, to their own advantage, because they were an agrarian culture. So God must have allowed this evil to occur during that time and justified it. Well, this is a gross misinterpretation of the Holy Torah. This is where I want to get quickly in bringing this documentary to conclusion, is reading some excerpts from Mishpatim, Parashat Mishpatim, that talks about indentured servitude, because there is a big difference between indentured servitude that's described in the Bible than the slavery, the act of slavery and enslaving people, invading a country, taking people through raiding parties by force and bringing them into a foreign nation and then forcing them to work for you. Okay, so bear with me. In Exodus chapter 21 verse 7, we learn that when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as male slaves do. They're talking about women are treated differently as men. Okay? In recent years, one of the greatest attacks against the Bible is that Scripture allegedly condones slavery. The brutality of the international slave trade was dominated by Christian philosophers, a Roman Catholic leadership, even by the Vatican and Pope. You think about the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, all of this. The Pope actually tolerated this, allowed it to occur. People chose to look another direction. They also blamed it on the Jews. It's in their Torah, then slavery must be allowed. No, it's not perfect, but it's a necessary evil. Okay. There are those who consider themselves more righteous and moral than the teaching of the Bible declare, see there, the Bible is full of slavery teaching, therefore what we're doing justifies our wrong. The conclusion is that if you're a Christian who believes the Bible is the inspired word of God, then you believe slavery is okay, and therefore you are not as moral as those enlightened generation, okay? People have their various justifications to justify their immoral behavior. This leads to the development of cults and other divergent religious beliefs. Such attackers are not only showing the ignorance of the Bible, they pick and choose their translations, and less than half of the modern translations render the word Ived as slaves, while the rest render as servants, as an indentured servant. What is the difference between a servant and a slave? Well, a servant is one who voluntarily serves and can leave the service at any time. You hear about the Year of Jubilee, the end of the Sabbatical year, Shemitah, between the 6th and 7th year. These indentured servant contracts, people can voluntarily leave the so-called masters, things of that nature at that time, and surely at the end of the 49 period, the Year of Jubilee. Indentured servitude was a necessary evil per se, allowed in the Torah simply because people, even though they're created equally in the image of God, their lifestyle choices that led to positive and negative outcomes. So many people, because of war, because of famine, because of issues and maybe in their marriages, just bad business choices, they would lose their real estate, they would lose their homes, things of that nature. And if they especially had family, had a wife and kids, they had to survive. So they had to be willing to sell themselves into indentured servitude for a certain contractually limited period of time. Okay, this indentured servitude, people were treated equally as someone who was not an indentured servant. Okay, slavery was actually a rarity in the Torah. In other words, it was considered a huge shame for a Jew to be sold off into slavery to a Gentile. But it did happen. I already described to you before how Jews were sold off at the highest bid throughout every nation on the planet as slaves, okay? As far as property, to be honest with you, the definition of the word for slavery was used a few times, the exception rule, but it was in the context where a Jewish businessman, a rich, wealthy person, would actually buy a Gentile, maybe from Canaan, a Canaanite, or someone from another area in the land of Israel, for a brief period of time, whatever, to be a slave. Okay, it was up to them, their sense of virtue and righteousness, to be able to release them if they wanted to be released. But a lot of this, this was, and they didn't have FDR during that time. They didn't have the social welfare system, the welfare state. This is how you mitigate homelessness. This is how you mitigate people dying from starvation, because people would voluntarily sell their lives over indentured servitude. In rare cases, when Israel conquered another nation like the Philistines, or people from other wars, foreigners came into the land, they didn't have anything else left to trade and barter with. That's all they had. They had to survive. They cared about their children, their families, and that meant working for their life, for someone as a slave. Okay? Bear with me, okay? Punishment was very strict for the ill treatment of an indentured servant or a slave. Many were forced into servitude in the military, for instance, against their will, but when they faced imprisonment of criminal record, which would ruin their life will, that's not a form of slavery. However, The draft and military conscription is something that existed for a long, long time. Under the laws of the land clearly state that no one can own a human being. So what is the difference between the slaves and early American history and being in the military? This is where I'm going here. As you know, many African slaves could be a free man if they joined the U.S. Army. And that's what I'm talking about here. There are a number of differences between a draftee and a slave. A draftee has certain legal rights. A slave had none. A draftee did not have the termination to his servitude. The slave did not. I'm sorry. The draftee did have a termination of servitude. You can be a free man if you serve so many years in the military. The slave did not have that afforded to them. The same thing applies to illegal aliens, undocumented migrants in our country. There's something in the Constitution. If you agree to join the U.S. Army as a military conscription, in the end, that is a path to citizenship. There's only one word in the Hebrew for slave and servant, is eved. I mentioned this before. This was widely mistranslated. Again, any translation, whether it's English, German, French, or whatever, in the various versions of the Bible, and there are many, is a human invention, okay? In ancient Hebrew, that's where you go back with truth. When we think of slavery, we think of slavery in our history when men and women were owned and considered property. An owner had the right to do what he wanted to do with his property, including rape. Although there were many slaves who lived distant lives as household servants and were beloved family members, believe it or not, they were not paid, they were not allowed the rights of citizen, they were treated differently under the law, and they could not be used in any way the master deemed. So there were laws that protected them as far as against abuse. If the master was tired of the slave service in the household, he could send them to the field or sell them to another slave owner. This usually happened when people became older. This is what we hear about when we hear the word slave. This is not what a Hebrew slave was. Okay, so you have the Gentile definition of what slavery was considered as their truth and factual. Then you have the Torah's definition of what a slave was. Okay, in Exodus chapter 21:2, when you purchase a Hebrew slave, right there you have a clear picture that the slave is property because it is purchased. If you just stop there, then you will run an entire doctrinal misinterpretation of the intended scripture to form your own religious doctrine for the abuse of human beings. First of all, when you consider the word when is key in Hebrew, which means basically because or if. If you acquire a servant, if you do this passage nor anywhere in the Torah is a servitude encouraged or required. The Torah only states that the rules to be applied if one acquires an eved, property, indentured servant. Secondly, the word purchase in Hebrew is kana, which is to purchase, but also means to simply acquire to redeem. Historically, the word redemption would be the best fit rather than purchase. Redemption is used a lot in the book of Leviticus when it refers to human beings. Okay, the year of Jubilee, when contracts of holding land that was taken from other people because they became poor, indentured servitude, and all this is a form of redemption when you return that land, return those homes, return their freedoms that they once enjoyed. The slavery mentioned in the book of Exodus is reference to indentured servitude. I would say 98% of the time. Okay, people that could not pay their debts, they were more concerned of their family than their own individual freedoms. However, when you read further in verse 2, you find that this period of servitude is to last on 6 years. The Sabbatical year, the year of Jubilee. The eved is to be set free. If you read further in this chapter, you'll find eved has many rights eved has many rights that a slave does not have. That brings us to verse 7 when it tells us when a daughter is sold in slavery, could a parent actually sell their own daughter? Well, true, the word makar does mean to sell. That is to receive something of value in return of something agreed, a value, a contract. The parents are not selling their child, but they are dealing with a matter of servitude. Maimonides, Ramban, the great Jewish commentator in the Code of Jewish Laws, points out that a man may not sell his daughter as a servant unless he is greatly impoverished and has no other resources. Some people lost their children because of poverty, impoverishment. Even then, it is understood that the daughter will either marry the master, or she have a form of resources, or have a son of the master and receive full rights as a wife. If the master refuses to marry the daughter, she must be redeemed and cannot be sold to any foreign master. Where I'm going is here that Hebrew slavery within the Hebrew culture was nothing close to slavery in early American history. So the justification of the evil that was allowed to occur in the United States and many other nations, international slave trade, had nothing to do with Judaism, had nothing to do with the doctrinal truths as we codify and understand as the 5 books of the Torah. In fact, the Apostle Paul uses servitude and slavery as an illustration of his service to God. I'm a bondservant to Christ and all this stuff, okay? Actually, Jews are actually bondservants to God. That's in our prayer life. That's in the King David mentioned that before, that we are indentured servants before God through free will choices, okay? So you have to understand the vernacular of language. You have to understand the original root of the language, like in Hebrew. You have to understand the context of language before you run off and create a doctrinal statement of truth and then change your worldview radically, as what was allowed to happen in colonial America leading up to the Civil War. Okay? In conclusion, a bondservant is one who voluntarily stays with his master after his period of servitude ends. The relationship between a bondservant and a master is one of respect and love. A bondservant serves not to pay off a debt, but this is over actually a love and family kind of tie. Think about Ruth and Boaz. Boaz with her kinsman redeemer, something similar to that. Not to avoid harsh punishment if his service does not meet a certain standard. He serves out of love for his master. I think we as Christians in general, because I know a lot of the target audience here for Torah Watchman show are Christians and Nohites. Christians tend to forget that they are a bondservant to God too. They adopt, at least today, from the Torah, the nature of being obligated to God as our master and king of the universe. As far as the idea of redemption, is throughout the book of laws, which is all of our mitzvot codified in the book of Leviticus. I encourage everyone to understand history, to understand where we're at today. You have to know where you've come and how the Torah, the Jewish Bible, was mangled, molested, and manipulated to justify the great evils I've just described in the international slave trade. Historically, it has been the oral Torah rather than the written Torah. That has been the greatest impact on civilization. As much as Rome ruled over Judea, Jewish values deeply transformed Rome, if not changing them forever. One of the results was the legal privileges eventually granted to slaves and the gradual recognition of the fundamental value of human life. For over 1,000 years, the church mangled and mismanaged and corrupted and subverted the message of Imago Deo, which is Latin that means in the image of God, that every human being is fundamentally created the same and equal, despite race, gender, creed, color of your face. Despite the repetition of this concept and the Genesis narrative 5 times, that we are created in the image of God. When it says we, it means be both Jew and Gentile. It means Nohites and those people of different religions and faiths and creeds and ethnicity, language and culture. This is a fundamental commandment and truth that's embedded throughout the 5 books of the Torah. It wasn't until the Italian Renaissance period that swept through Europe and eventually to America that a new humanist spirit dawned, and the idea could no longer be repressed. Again, that God created everyone, all walks of life, poor and rich people, born of royalty, born of slavery, they were all created the same way, okay? That became the new normative way of looking at people and judging people, even in our magistrates and our court system. The oratory on the dignity of man is often touted as a manifesto of the Renaissance and early humanism. It was composed by Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. It's no secret that Pico studied under the greatest rabbis of his time and was obsessed, incidentally, with the Zohar and Kabbalah. Here are a few examples, please bear with me. The greatest force in emancipation of slavery in colonial times were the Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers. Historians discuss phenomena of the Quakers in the context of Hebraizing of Christianity. That's an interesting quoted phrase there. Essentially, it's the Hebrew, indoctrination of the traditional Christian doctrine, okay? It's the way you live your life. It's the way you manage your choices over generations of time, okay? So again, the leaders were deeply influenced by readings of Kabbalah and translation and by humanists who had learned their ideas from rabbinical sources. The history of emancipation is complex and long and viciously controversial, not politically correct at all. In truth, Jews took roles on both sides of this prickly fence. Aaron Lopez, for instance, a convert to Judaism, brought slaves on some of his ships to America, okay? On the other hand, Baron Neffen de Rothschild and a gentleman by the name of Sir Moses Montefiore made possible the Great Slave Emancipation Act of 1835 by granting 20 million pounds sterling in loan subsidies. And the struggle, eventually the true Jewish spirit prevailed. And it is those values that Maimonides, Ramban, the most, I would say, the genius of the 12th century in the Middle Ages, the greatest of minds of that time, espoused about. Eventually, it became dominant in our society. So what started out by Moshe Rabban Maimonides is that was not accepted at this time, new ideas, and competing in the world of ideas, not politically correct, but eventually became the dominant truth. Again, indentured servitude, as described in the Torah, is not the same thing as slaves that dominated, unfortunately, much of humanity's history since the New Bronze Age. Take care. Y'all, ben-Emmett signing out. Please share the web of knowledge and truth to everyone you know. I'm here as a lightman on the hill to get the truth out to you. I learn something every time I read books and research things. I would be selfish if I did not share them with my beloved target audience here, the Torah Watchman Show.